Hammer Films was in decline. By the late 1970s, the production company had lost its stronghold on the horror genre and was in serious debt. The studio entered receivership in 1979, with Roy Skeggs and Brian Lawrence taking over and shifting focus, moving away from theatrically released horror films and into the world of television. An anthology series focused on horror, something so comfortable and familiar for the studio, would be an attempt at moving into a new age. The Hammer House of Horror was shown on ITV in Britain. Its first episode was written by Anthony Reed, a Doctor Who writer, and directed by Don Lever, an experienced British television director known for work on shows such as The Avengers. The episode would follow the story of Lucinda Jessup, a 17th century witch who has escaped from being burned at the stake and is now in the modern day, staking her claim to composer David Winter. The cast would feature John Finch, Patricia Quinn, Prunella G, and Ian McCulloch. The series premiere was shown on September 13th, 1980. So with this brief context laid out, let's review the Hammer House of Horror series premiere, Witching Time. Hammer's move to television was done with the same budgetary restraint as their films, but without as much of the style. The episode features a small cast of characters and locations, preferring to dwell on our main characters' psychological torment and spiraling downfall. Paranoia festers and diabolical machinations are hatched. The story is simple, but mixed with just enough strange and macabre genre elements to keep it interesting. It starts with a tease for a slasher film following the POV shot of a killer stalking his victim, about to pounce before we are brought into a much more classical mode of horror storytelling, the story of the witch. David Winter is a workaholic, depressed because he suspects that his wife is having an affair. She is. With his friend and doctor, Charles Henderson, the witch from the 17th century, Lucinda Jessup, strains this marriage to its breaking point. It's almost comical how diabolical Mary suspects her husband of being. Blood flowing from the bathtub faucet, a statuette falling on its own accord, a bird with its head cut off, all things her husband must be doing to gaslight her into believing in the witch. It's fascinating to see the dual collapse of the sanity of both of our protagonists. The story of infidelity, psychological descent, and ultimately marital perseverance in the face of old-school witchcraft is resolved as Mary is the one who steps up to defeat Lucinda. This downhill spiral of paranoia ramps up to a frantic finale. The showdown amongst the fire is both silly and visually interesting. We get a ridiculously self-serious use of a puppet and some wonderful overacting that culminates in an appropriately low-budget final off-screen death. The episode's melodramatic writing, represented through generic television directing and acting, undermines any true horror potential. I love it when these genres are mixed well. I adore Malignant and the Insidious movies. However, those films match the heightened theatricality of their stories with intense style. This episode uses melodrama in service of a basic story executed in a generic television style. Still, the episode has fun and funny moments that keep my attention. The acting is okay, John Finch and Patricia Quinn both give fun performances, and the hysterical nature of Prunella G's character adds to the tone. The music is good. I especially love the main theme, which is eerie and hauntingly moody. I love the little music David comes up with while possessed by the witch. I also really like some of the practical effects. The fire being a real fire and not CGI, as is so common in modern films, feels refreshing in retrospect, and adds to the manic nature of the finale. We get the blood and sexuality we expect from Hammer without the luscious use of color that also helped make its name. The episode was cut for air on ITV, but the episode I watched had those scenes reinserted, and I'm curious if it was the nudity and sexual content that was cut. I couldn't find an answer, but I'm curious if anyone who saw the original British cuts of the episode knows the answer. What I saw seems a bit transgressive for 1980 British television. This is in contrast to a relative lack of blood, which was a bit tamer compared to the slasher cycle that was just starting to get heated up in North America. What had made Hammer so famous was no longer enough, and this episode was not enough to reinvigorate a new era for the studio. The directing is solid, the acting is okay, and it's a fun and funny episode. It's not as self-parodying as the later Hammer films were, but it still lacks a serious horror punch. I enjoyed this episode and will review more in the future, so look out for that. Did any of you grow up watching Hammer House of Horror? Let me know your experience with the show in the comments below. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.